You're walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, marble columns gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, the scent of olive oil and bread wafting from nearby shops. Citizens in their pristine togas discuss politics and philosophy, while merchants hawk their wares in the forum. This is the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of law and order, the empire that gave us concepts of justice that still influence our world today. But if you look closer, if you peer beyond the magnificent facades and golden statues, you'll witness something that will make your stomach turn. In the shadows of those same marble columns, human beings are being bought and sold like cattle. Women and girls are dragged through slave markets, their bodies examined like livestock, their futures decided by men who view them as nothing more than breathing property. These weren't isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. They were legal practices, social norms, and economic systems that turned half the population into objects for the pleasure and profit of their masters. Before we continue, if you're interested in learning about the darker truths of history that textbooks often gloss over, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin with perhaps the most fundamentally horrifying aspect of female slavery in ancient Rome, the complete absence of legal personhood. Under Roman law, enslaved women had no rights whatsoever. They weren't considered people in the eyes of the legal system. They were property, classified alongside cattle, furniture, and farming tools in legal documents. This wasn't some abstract legal concept. It had devastating real-world consequences. When a Roman man sexually assaulted a female slave, he couldn't be prosecuted for rape because you can't rape property. The only legal recourse was if someone damaged another person's slave, in which case the owner could sue for property damage under the Lex Aquilia. Think about that for a moment. A woman's sexual violation was treated exactly like someone scratching your chariot or breaking your vase. The implications were staggering. Roman legal texts matter-of-factly discuss how a master could use his female slaves sexually without any legal consequences. The philosopher Artemidorus, writing around 170 AD, described dreams about having sex with one's own female slaves as positive omens because slaves were possessions and taking pleasure in your possessions was considered good fortune. But the system went even deeper than personal exploitation. Roman masters regularly forced their female slaves into prostitution, profiting from their sexual abuse on an industrial scale. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii shows graffiti advertising female slaves for sexual services, treating human trafficking as casually as we might advertise a garage sale today. The vulnerability of female slaves extended into every aspect of their existence. Roman households were designed without separate sleeping quarters for slaves. Kitchen slaves slept where they worked. Stable slaves bedded down next to the animals they tended. And personal servants were expected to sleep in their masters' rooms or across their doorways. This arrangement left women completely exposed to nighttime assault with no possibility of escape or privacy. Wall paintings from Pompeii reveal the casual way Romans treated their slaves during intimate moments. These frescoes show enslaved servants standing around with towels and lamps, while their masters had sex, treated as living furniture rather than human beings with dignity or feelings. Romans wouldn't have dreamed of such public displays in front of other free citizens, but slaves were viewed as household objects, no different from the lamps they carried. The legal system reinforced this dehumanization through practices that would horrify modern observers. Roman law stated that a slave's testimony could only be accepted in court if obtained through torture. The reasoning was grotesquely circular. Slaves were considered too dishonest to tell the truth voluntarily, but pain would force them to be honest. Of course, the Romans understood that testimony extracted through torture was unreliable, but they continued the practice anyway. Female slaves faced punishments that were designed to be as psychologically devastating as they were physically brutal. For minor infractions, they might be beaten with sticks or flogged with leather whips. But for more serious offenses, their torturers added metal studs, bone fragments, or lead weights to the whips to maximize damage. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was the complete destruction of the human spirit. Runaway female slaves faced particularly cruel consequences. They were branded on the forehead with hot irons, marking them permanently as fugitives. These brands served as lifetime advertisements of their attempt to claim freedom, ensuring they could never blend into free society, even if they escaped again. Some were forced to wear wooden collars around their necks, like dog tags, identifying them as property and advertising rewards for their return. The collective punishment laws reveal the true scope of Roman cruelty toward enslaved women. When a master was murdered by one of his slaves, Roman law required that every slave in the household be executed, regardless of their involvement in the crime. In 61 AD, when Senator Lucius Pedanius Secundus was killed by one of his slaves, Emperor Nero upheld the law requiring the execution of all 400 slaves in the household, including women, children, and elderly servants who had no connection to the murder. This law created a climate of terror where female slaves lived in constant fear, not just of their own actions, but of what their fellow slaves might do. A kitchen maid could be crucified because a field hand committed a crime she knew nothing about. The psychological torture of this system was as calculated as any physical punishment. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of female slavery in Rome was how it corrupted the very concept of family and motherhood. Enslaved women couldn't legally marry, even to other slaves. Any relationships they formed were called contubernium, a term that literally meant sharing a tent, emphasizing the temporary and legally meaningless nature of slave relationships. When enslaved women became pregnant, their children automatically became property of the master. These mothers had no parental rights whatsoever. Their babies could be sold away at any time, given as gifts, or killed at the master's whim. Roman agricultural writers advised treating pregnant slaves like breeding livestock, calculating the economic value of their offspring against the cost of feeding and housing the mothers. The reproductive exploitation of female slaves was systematic and calculating. Masters often restricted male slaves to relationships only with women they also owned, ensuring that any children would add to their wealth rather than benefit a competitor. Young women in their reproductive years were sometimes freed specifically so they could bear legitimate children who would be Roman citizens. But this mercy was reserved for a tiny fraction of enslaved women and came only after their most fertile years had been exploited. The average recorded age at death for urban slaves in Rome was 17.12 years. For females, it was slightly higher at 17.9, but this marginal difference hardly constitutes mercy. These numbers represent the brutal reality that most enslaved women died before reaching 20, their lives consumed by a system that viewed them as disposable resources. Archaeological evidence from across the Roman world confirms these horrific statistics. Slave cemeteries show signs of malnutrition, overwork, and violent deaths. Many female skeletons bear evidence of repeated injuries consistent with regular beatings and sexual assault. The physical remains tell stories of lives lived in constant pain and fear, bodies broken by a society that refused to acknowledge their humanity. Roman religious practices institutionalized the abuse of female slaves in ways that reveal the deep cultural acceptance of their mistreatment. During the annual Matralia festival, dedicated to motherhood and childbirth, slave women were not only excluded from participation, but ritually beaten and expelled from the ceremony. Free women would physically assault a slave girl as part of their religious observance, turning cruelty into sacred ritual. This religious exclusion was particularly cruel because it denied enslaved women participation in ceremonies related to the very experiences that defined their exploitation: pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood. They were beaten and cast out from festivals celebrating the biological functions their masters profited from, creating a spiritual dimension to their physical and psychological abuse. The evidence of these practices comes from Roman writers who documented them without shame or apology. They kept detailed records of slave prices, punishment methods, and exploitation techniques, with the same bureaucratic efficiency they brought to taxation and military planning. These weren't secrets hidden from history. They were standard operating procedures for a civilization that built its wealth on human suffering. The sophistication of Roman cruelty extended far beyond simple physical abuse into psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit completely. Masters developed elaborate systems of humiliation that attacked every aspect of a slave woman's identity and dignity. They understood that controlling the mind was more effective than merely controlling the body. Female slaves were forced to participate in their own degradation through practices that would make modern psychologists recoil in horror. During dinner parties, enslaved women were required to serve food and wine while completely naked, their bodies on display for the entertainment of guests who treated them like living sculptures. They had to maintain perfect composure while being groped, fondled, and propositioned by drunk aristocrats who saw nothing wrong with treating human beings like party decorations. The dinner party humiliations went deeper than mere nudity. Wealthy Romans developed games where female slaves were forced to compete for scraps of food or small rewards through increasingly degrading acts. They might be required to crawl on hands and knees, bark like dogs, or perform sexual acts with each other while guests placed bets on their performance. The winners received slightly better treatment for a few days, creating a system where survival depended on the willingness to abandon all human dignity. These entertainments weren't occasional cruelties inflicted by particularly sadistic masters. They were standard social practices documented in letters between aristocratic families who traded tips on the most amusing ways to humiliate their human property. Pliny the Younger wrote casually to friends about dinner parties where the slave entertainment was so creative that guests talked about it for weeks afterward. The Romans developed a hierarchy of slave abuse that reveals their methodical approach to human destruction. Newly captured women faced the most brutal treatment designed to break their spirits completely before they could adapt to their new circumstances. They were often gang-raped by groups of male slaves while their masters watched, a practice that served multiple purposes. It destroyed the new slave's sense of self-worth, entertained the master, and reinforced the complete powerlessness of all enslaved people. Once broken through these initial assaults, female slaves entered a system where their treatment depended entirely on their ability to please their masters in whatever way was demanded. Those who resisted or showed signs of maintaining their humanity faced increasingly creative punishments. Roman households developed specialized torture chambers where female slaves could be subjected to prolonged abuse without risk of killing valuable property too quickly. The torture methods reveal a sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied to the most evil purposes. Rather than simply beating slaves into submission, Romans developed techniques that attacked the mind and spirit. Female slaves might be forced to watch other women being tortured, while being told their compliance could spare their fellow sufferers. This created impossible moral dilemmas where survival required participating in the abuse of other victims. Some masters specialized in psychological manipulation that would impress modern cult leaders. They would alternate between extreme cruelty and unexpected kindness, creating trauma bonds that made enslaved women emotionally dependent on their abusers. A female slave might be tortured mercilessly for weeks, then suddenly treated with apparent affection and given small luxuries. This unpredictable pattern destroyed the victim's ability to understand or predict their situation, leaving them completely psychologically dependent on their master's whims. The Romans understood that hope was more dangerous to their system than despair. Slaves who gave up completely were less productive than those who maintained just enough hope to keep trying. Masters carefully calibrated the balance between crushing spirits and maintaining just enough possibility of improvement to keep their human property functional. Female slaves might be told they could earn small privileges through good behavior, but these rewards were always temporary and could be revoked without warning. The breeding programs for female slaves revealed perhaps the most calculated cruelty of all. Masters didn't simply force women to reproduce randomly. They developed elaborate systems for maximizing the quality and quantity of slave children, treating human reproduction like agricultural science. Female slaves were studied for their physical characteristics, intelligence and temperament, then matched with male slaves to produce offspring with desired traits. These breeding programs included detailed record-keeping that tracked bloodlines across generations. Masters maintained genealogies of their human livestock with the same care they devoted to horse breeding, noting which combinations produced the strongest workers, the most attractive house slaves, or the most compliant personalities. Female slaves were evaluated not just for their immediate usefulness, but for their potential to produce valuable offspring throughout their reproductive years. The psychological impact on mothers in this system defies comprehension. They were forced to bear children knowing those babies would never belong to them, might be sold away at any moment, and would likely face the same horrors they endured daily. Some mothers tried to kill their newborns to spare them a life of slavery, but masters anticipated this and often chained pregnant women during their final months to prevent infanticide. Roman medical writers documented techniques for maximizing slave reproduction with the same clinical detachment they brought to treating injured gladiators. They developed diets and exercise regimens designed to keep female slaves healthy enough to bear multiple children while minimizing the cost of their care. These medical texts read like veterinary manuals, discussing human beings as breeding stock, whose value lay entirely in their reproductive capacity. The social dynamics within slave communities were deliberately corrupted by their masters to prevent solidarity and resistance. Romans understood that enslaved people who formed strong bonds with each other posed a greater threat to the system. They developed strategies to turn slaves against each other, creating hierarchies and competitions that made cooperation impossible. Female slaves were often forced to inform on each other, reporting any signs of disobedience or resistance to their masters. Those who provided useful information might receive slightly better treatment, creating a surveillance state within the slave quarters where no one could trust anyone else. Women who had been friends or lovers were forced to betray each other to survive, destroying the relationships that might have provided comfort in an unbearable existence. The corruption of these relationships extended to forcing enslaved women to participate in punishing their fellow slaves. A woman might be required to whip her own daughter or sister, while their master watched for signs of mercy that would result in harsher punishment for both victim and punisher. These forced betrayals were designed to destroy any sense of solidarity or shared humanity among the enslaved population. The Romans even corrupted maternal relationships by forcing slave mothers to choose which of their children would receive punishment when infractions occurred. A master might catch two slave children in some minor misdeed and force their mother to select which one would be beaten. This created impossible situations where love became a weapon used to inflict psychological torture on entire families. The documentation of these practices exists in disturbing detail because the Romans saw nothing shameful in their behavior. They kept meticulous records of their techniques, shared strategies with other slave owners, and wrote instructional manuals on the most effective methods of human exploitation. These documents survive today in archives and libraries, filed away like any other historical records, waiting for researchers brave enough to examine humanity's capacity for systematic evil. The economic calculations underlying female slavery reveal the true scope of Roman cruelty. Masters maintained detailed cost-benefit analyses of different forms of exploitation, calculating the optimal balance between immediate profit and long-term productivity. They knew exactly how much abuse a female slave could endure before becoming too damaged to be useful, and they calibrated their cruelty to maximize return on investment. The Roman Empire lasted over 1,000 years, and throughout that entire span, these practices shaped the lives of millions of women whose names we'll never know and whose stories were never recorded. Their suffering built the roads we still admire, funded the architecture we still study, and supported the legal systems we still reference. But understanding these horrors isn't about condemning modern Italy or Christianity. It's about recognizing how power structures can corrupt human sexuality and turn the most intimate aspects of life into weapons of control. It's about remembering the countless victims whose humanity was denied by history itself. And it's about ensuring that we remain vigilant against the conditions that allow such systematic dehumanization to flourish. The evidence is there, waiting in archives and archaeological sites across 3 continents. These weren't ancient practices from a distant world. The last remnants of Roman slavery persisted well into the medieval period, and its legal frameworks influenced European law for centuries afterward. This history is closer than we think, and its lessons remain painfully relevant today.